You're about to watch a golden time capsule. 4 filmed conversations with C.G. Jung, recorded over 4 days in Switzerland in 1957. The interviewer is Richard Evans, a psychology professor from the University of Houston. These films were made for psychology students and at Jung's request were edited into a shorter version by the analyst Joseph Henderson. This is that cut, restored and put back in chronological order, based on the full transcript. The original sound was often faint or distorted, and some parts remain rough or unintelligible. To make sure meaning isn't lost, I've created accurate subtitles based on the transcript. At the age of 82, Jung's presence and expression are full of life. Jung is rooted in empirical evidence, yet open to depth that make life mysterious and vigorous. There's a mercurial twinkle in his eye, the look of someone who has seen and realized hidden places in the psyche, as few have. His words carry both weight and warmth. You can feel a man who has wrestled with ideas until they became tools, and with symbols that serve as living realities. Jung's influence grows slowly as time passes, far beyond fashion. His work tends to be carried forward not by mainstream establishment, but by individuals who prove it in their own lives and callings. His ideas demand testing and experience. They are instruments to use. You have to meet them in your dreams and conflicts, in love and work, in illness and transformation. Jung influenced far outside psychology, into theology, history, art, physics, among other fields, because he addresses patterns that show up wherever human beings wrestle with symbols and fate. Here's a thread to hold on to while you watch. For Jung, the psyche is real, autonomous, and oriented towards wholeness. It compensates what's one-sided. We keep our balance, personally and culturally, by listening to the unconscious as it speaks through dreams, intuitions, synchronicities, symptoms, moods, and symbols that press for our attention. They visit everyone, ancient and modern, and deserve careful notice. The unconscious isn't a junk room of repressed thoughts. It's a creative partner, a source of new life that acts on its own. In the first session, Jung recounts how, as a young psychiatrist, his word association work led to the discovery of feeling-toned complexes and to the fact that the unconscious can interrupt our speech, memory, and actions. He honors Freud's breakthrough while widening his frame. The unconscious is not just a byproduct of repression. It is a creative partner that generates new contents. And libido is not only sexual drive, but the general energy of the psyche, able to flow into hunger, power, curiosity, religious experience, art, and love. With that shift, it trades a single cause model for a multi-layered field of energies and symbols, placing dreams and myths in their right place, as archetypal expressions of the source of all images, rather than repressed disguises. Jung refuses the notion that the unconscious is merely an epiphenomenon of consciousness, a view that is still prevalent today and shows how it is in fact the autonomous matrix of psychic life. In the second session, Jung names the social mask we all wear, the persona, and distinguishes it from the ego and from the deeper center he calls the self, the deeper core of the personality. He lays out his map of types: introversion and extroversion as basic attitudes, and 4 functions for orienting to life: sensation, what's there; thinking, what it is; feeling, what it's worth; and intuition, where it's headed. Don't turn types into boxes, he warns. The unconscious inferior side balances the conscious one. He explains anima and animus, the inner feminine and inner masculine images, as forces that can seize us or lift us up, and that we eventually have to relate to consciously. In the third session, Jung talks about psychic energy by analogy with physics, flow and gradients, and about the psyche's pull towards balance. Neurosis, he says, is created by the wrong attitude right now, even if it has roots in the past, and so healing is always a possibility. because attitude can change in the present. Jung works with dreams because the unconscious expresses itself in symbols that complete what consciousness lives out. He discusses J.B. Rhine's experiments and introduces what he calls synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, events outside of causality. He follows evidence and experience and lets facts challenge assumptions. You'll also hear him talk about psychosomatic illness and his caution about using tranquilizers as shortcuts when the real work is moral and psychological. In the final session, Jung turns to training and culture. Psychology, for him, can't just be lab methods and statistics. We need history, myth, religion, language, and the arts, because the psyche speaks in age-old images. Marie-Louise von Franz, a close collaborator of Jung for several decades, says that Jung wrote and worked with a double bottom, rigorous observation on one level, and on another, a living relationship to the symbols themselves. Listen that way, both scientifically and devotionally, and you'll catch the depth he's pointing to. What he offers isn't a system of belief, but a way of seeing that asks for authentic participation. Our dreams, our conflicts, and our courage to face what grips us, while we consciously strive toward a relationship with the center that can hold and direct us. If something here speaks to you, carry it into practice, in dream work, honest relationships, creative work, and service. With that, let's begin.
Dr. Jung, many of us who have read a great deal of your work, of course, are aware of the fact that in your early work, you were, to some degree, at least in association with Dr. Sigmund Freud. And I know it would be of great interest to many of us to hear a little bit about how you happened to hear of Dr. Freud and how you happened to become involved with some of his work and ideas.
Well, as a matter of fact, it was in the year 1900, in December, soon after Freud's book about dream interpretation had come out, that I was asked by my chief, Professor Bleuler, to give a review of the book. I studied the book very attentively, and I didn't understand many things in it, which weren't clear at all to me. But from others' parts, I got the impression that this man really knew what he was talking about. And I thought that this is certainly a masterpiece, full of future. I had no idea then of ideas of my own. I was just it was just when I began my career as an assistant in the psychiatric clinic. And then I began with experimental psychology or psychopathology. I applied the experimental association method by Wundt, and the same that has been applied in the Kapellin's psychiatric clinic in Munich. And I had studied the results, and I had the idea one should go once more over it. So I made these association tests, and I found out that the important thing in them has been missed, because it is not interesting to see that there is a reaction, a certain reaction to a stimulus world. That is more or less uninteresting. But the interesting thing is why people could not react to certain stimulus worlds, or in an entirely inadequate way. And then I began to study these places in the experiment where the attention or the capability, apparently, of the test person began to waver or to disappear. And I found soon out that it is matter of intimate personal affairs people were thinking of, or which were in them, even if they momentarily did not think of them, when they were unconscious, with other words, that nevertheless an inhibition came from the unconscious and hindered the expression in speech. And then, in examining all these cases as carefully as possible, I saw that it was matter of what Freud called repressions. I also saw what he meant by symbolization.
In other words, from your word association studies, some of the things in the interpretation of dreams began to fall into place. Right, your own thinking.
Right. And then I wrote a book about the psychology of dementia precox, was called now schizophrenia.
Yes.
And I sent the book to Freud and wrote to him about my association experiments and how they confirmed his theory thus far. And that is how my friendship with Freud began.
Now, one of the, of course, very fundamental ideas in the original psychoanalytic theory was Freud's conception of the libido as sort of a broad psychic sexual energy. Of course, we all know that you began to feel that that Dr. Freud might have had perhaps a little bit too much stress on sexuality in his theory. Now, when did you begin first feeling this? In other words, was this the sort of a feeling that you had almost from the beginning? Or as time went by, did you begin to feel this way?
Well, you see, in the beginning, I had naturally certain prejudice against his conceptions. And after a while, I overcame them. I could do that from owing to my biological training. And I could not deny the importance of the sexual instinct, you know.
Yes.
But later on, I saw that it was very one-sided. Because, you see, man is not only governed by the sex instinct, there are other instincts as well. For instance, in biology, you see, the nutritional instinct is just as important as the sex instinct. Also, in primitive societies, sexuality plays a role much smaller than food. Food is the all-important interest and desire. Sex, that is something I can have everywhere. They are not shy. But the food is difficult to obtain, you see? Yes. And so it is the main interest. And then in other societies, for instance, in civilized societies, power drive plays a much greater role than sex. For instance, there are many big businessmen who are impotent because their whole energy is going into money-making or dictating the laws to everybody else. That's much more interesting than affairs of women.
So, in a sense, as you began to look over Dr. Freud's emphasis on the sexual drive, you began to think in terms of other cultures and broader ideas, and it began to seem to you that this wasn't really an emphasis that was universal or sufficiently universal to be important.
Well, you know, I couldn't help seeing it because I had studied Nietzsche. I knew the works of Nietzsche very well. He had been a professor at Bali University, you know, and that the air was full of talk about Nietzsche. And so naturally I had studied his works here, and there I saw an entirely different psychology, which was also psychology, perfectly competent psychology, but all built upon the power drive.
Do you think it's possible that Dr. Freud was either ignoring Nietzsche or had perhaps not wanted to be influenced by Nietzsche?
I mean, his personal motivation. Well, of course, it was a personal prejudice. You see, it happened to be his main point. You know, certain people are chiefly looking for this side and other people to another side. Yes. So, you see, the inferior Dr. Adler, the younger, the weaker, naturally had a power complex. He wanted to be the successful man. Freud was a successful man. He was on top, and so he was interested only in pleasure, in the pleasure principle, while Adler was interested in the power drive.
Yeah, I see. You feel that it's sort of a function of his own personality to some degree.
Yeah, it is quite natural. You see, it is one of the two ways how to deal with reality. Either you make reality an object for pleasure, if you are powerful enough already, or you make it an object of your desire to grab it or
Now-
to possess it.
Some observers have thought that perhaps the patients that Dr. Freud saw in Vienna of this period were often individuals who were repressed sexually, and that perhaps that so many of these patients having been of this type, that this may have been one thing that sort of reinforced Dr. Freud's ideas. In other words, in a sense that the Viennese society was a rather, quote, repressed society. Now, would you think that this might have been a factor?
Well, it is certainly so that in the end of the Victorian age, there was a reaction going over the whole world against the taboos, the sex taboos.
Yeah.
One didn't understand anymore properly why or why not. And Freud belongs into that time, a sort of liberation of the mind of such taboos.
There was a reaction then against the sort of tight, pivoted
Yes.
culture he was living in.
Oh, yes. And you see, Freud in that way, or on that side, really belonged to the category of a Nietzschean mind. Nietzsche had liberated Europe from a great deal of such prejudices, but concerning the power drive, our illusions as to the motivations of our morality. It was a time critical of morality.
So then, in a sense, Dr. Freud was taking it in another direction in equal amount of force.
And then, moreover, it is sex being the main instinct, the predominating instinct in a more or less safe society, where the social conditions are more or less safe. There, sexuality is apt to predominate because people are taken care of, they have their positions, they have enough food, no question of hunting and seeking food or something like that. Then it is quite probable that the patients you meet have more or less all a certain sexual complex.
So this is, in a sense, the drive of that particular society most likely to be inhibited.
It is a sort of finesse, almost, when you find out that somebody has a power drive. And where sex only serves the purpose of power. For instance, a charming man, all women think he's the real hero of all hearts. He's a power devil. Like a Don Juan, The woman is not his problem. His problem is how to dominate. You see? And so you see, in the second place, after sex comes the power drive. And even that is not the end.
Now, in the going sort of fundamentally through the development of Dr. Freud's theory, which of course was a sort of a significant factor in, as you say, in the development of many of your own early ideas. Dr. Freud, of course, talked a great deal about the unconscious.
The unconscious is something which is really unconscious. So you have no object, you see nothing.
No.
You only can make inferences, And so we have to create a model of this possible structure of the unconscious because we can't see it. Now, you see, he came to the concept of the unconscious, chiefly on the basis of the same experience I had made in the association experiment, namely that people reacted. They said things, they did things without knowing that they did it or said it. And this is something you can observe experimentally in the association experiment, where people cannot remember afterwards what they did or what they said in the moment where a stimulus word hits the complex. With the reproduction, in the so-called reproduction experiment, you go through the whole list, and you will see that the memory fails where there was a complex reaction. And that is the simple fact. Freud has based his idea of the unconscious on, because that is what you can see time and again, that people, for instance, make a mistake in speech, or that they say something which I didn't mean to say, that should just make ridiculous mistakes, you know. There are no end of stories, you know, about how people can betray themselves by saying something they didn't mean to say at all. Yet, in the unconscious meant him to say that thing, just that thing. For instance, when you want to express your sympathy at a funeral, you go to somebody and you say, "I congratulate you." That's pretty painful, you know, but that happens, and it is true. Now, this is something that goes parallel now with the whole school of the Salpêtrière in Paris. There were Pierre Chardin, who has worked out that side of the unconscious reactions quite particularly. Now, Freud refers very little to Pierre Chardin. I have studied with Pierre Chardin in Paris, and he has formed my ideas very much. He was a first-class observer, though he had no dynamic theory about, no psychological theory, it was a sort of physiological theory of the unconscious phenomena as a so-called abaissement du niveau mental. There is a certain depotentiation of the tension of consciousness. It sinks below the level of consciousness and thus becomes unconscious. Now, that is right due to only, he says, it sinks down because it is helped, it is repressed from above. That was my first point of difference with Freud. I say there are cases, in my observation, where there was no repression from above, but the thing itself withdrew. Those contents that became unconscious have withdrawn all by themselves. They were not repressed. On the contrary, they have a certain autonomy. There I discovered the concept of autonomy, and that these contents that disappear have the power to move independently from my will. Either they appear when I want to say something definite, they interfere and speak themselves instead of what I wanted to say. Or they make me do something which I didn't want to do at all. Or they withdraw in the moment where I want to use them. They suddenly disappear.
And this is independent of any of the, you might say in a sense, of the pressures on the conscious, as Freud would have...
There can be such cases, sure, you know. But beside them, there are also the cases that show that the unconscious contents acquire a certain independence. And all mental contents that have a certain feeling tone that is emotional, has the value of an emotion, of an affect, have the tendency to become autonomous. So you see, anybody in an emotion will say and do things which he cannot vouch for. He must excuse himself of that I was in a state. It was not compos mentis.
Now, in addition to, of course, the repression, the fact that repressed material is present in the unconscious, of course, as I pointed out before, to mention briefly, Dr. Freud recognized that, in a sense, the individual was born entirely a victim of what he later called an id, or a total sort of unconscious, undeveloped, sort of a full animal organism. And he, I think, is not very easily seen where all these drives, all these instincts came from, as if there's some allusion to the fact that they are the result of phylogenetic inheritance, that they are carried over from previous developments.
You see, nobody knows where instincts come from. They are there, you find them. That is a story that has been played millions of years ago,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
sexuality has been invented, and I wasn't there, so I don't know how that happened. Feeding has been invented very much longer than even sex, and why and how it has been invented, I don't know. I haven't been there, so we don't know where that thing comes from.
Yeah.
And it's quite ridiculous, you know, to speculate about such an impossibility. So the question is only, where do those cases come from where instinct does not function? That is something within our reach, because we can study the cases where instinct does not function.
Now, could you give us some rather specific examples of what you mean of cases where the instinct does not function?
Oh, well, you see, you instead of instinct, which is a habitual form of activity,
Yes.
take any other form of habitual activity. And once, suddenly, that thing doesn't function. But take a singer who is absolutely controlling his voice. Suddenly he can't sing. Or any other, take a man who writes fluently. Suddenly he makes a ridiculous mistake. There, his habit doesn't function. Well, you see, when you ask me something, I'm supposed to be able to react to you. Suddenly I'm much better. For instance, if you succeed to touch one of my complexes, you can see me that I'm absolutely perplexed. I'm dépossédé.
Well,
And words fail me.
But we haven't seen you very perplexed. You haven't seen you very perplexed yet, actually.
For instance, at exam psychology, you know, a fellow who knows stuff quite well, the professor asked him, he cannot say a word.
Block.
Yeah,
Block. Now, going a little further, another part of Dr. Freud's theory, of course, which became very important, as we've already alluded to, was the idea of the conscious, that out of this sort of an unconscious, instinctual structure that the individual has, and out of this emerges, as a result of this structures, and of course the word structure has to be put in quotation marks, as you point out, this is only a model, but as this structure comes in contact with reality of the world, out of it begins to emerge a consciousness, a man's conception almost of himself. Now, Freud then, of course, called this structure the ego.
Yes.
Now, his ego then was really the product of reality, in a sense also perhaps the product of frustration as the individual developed. Now,
you speak of the general psychological conception of the ego.
Yes. Now, in your work, of course, you also are interested in this conscious totality for the whole organism. Now, what about your conception of this conscious totality? Would you agree, for example, with the statement that this is something that emerges out of man's contact with reality?
But that he has an ego at all? That is your question?
Yes.
Oh, well, you see, that's again such a case. I haven't been there when it was invented. Although, you see, you can observe it to a certain extent with a child, because child definitely begins in a state where there is no ego. And then about the fourth year or before, you know, but about that time, the child develops a sense of ego, I, myself. And that is, in the first place, a certain identity with the body. Yeah. For instance, when you ask primitives, then they emphasize always the body. For instance, you ask now, who has brought this thing here? We'll say, I have brought it. No accent on the I. Simply brought it. And they say, but have you brought it? And he says, and here, with me. Yes, I myself, this thing here. So the identity, you know, with the body is one of the first things which make an ego. It is the the spatial separateness that induces apparently the concept of an ego. And then, of course, there are lots of other things. Later on, it is mental differences, personal differences of all sorts, etc. You see, the ego is continuously building up. It is not a finished product, never.
Yes,
it builds up. You see, no year passes where you do not discover a new little aspect in which you are more ego than you thought.
Of course, one of the central parts of the so-called psychosexual development in the more or less orthodox psychoanalytic theory is the so-called Oedipus complex.
Yes.
I believe the term complex was yours originally.
That is just what I call an archetype. That is the first archetype Freud has discovered. The first and the only one. He thinks that this is the archetype. But of course, there are many such archetypes. You look at Greek mythology and you find any amount of them, or look at dreams and you find any amount of them. But incest was so impressive to him that he even has chosen the term Oedipus complex, because that was one of the outstanding examples of an incest complex. And it is only the masculine form, mind you, because women have an incest complex too, but there it is not an Oedipus. So it is something else. So it is only the term for archetypal way of behavior in case of a man's relation, say, to his mother. It also means to the daughter, because whatever he was to the mother, he will be it to the daughter too. It can be this way or that way. It depends.
So then you will accept, in other words, the Oedipus complex, but not as being the only important such influence. You will see this is just one of many fundamental,
many ways of behavior. Now, see, the Oedipus gives you an excellent example of the behavior of an archetype. Now, see, the archetype is a force. It has an autonomy. It can suddenly seize you. It is like a seizure. So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, that is such a case. You see, you have a certain image in yourself without knowing it of the woman, of the real woman. Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type, and instantly you get a seizure, and you're gone. And afterwards, you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. Or you see, a man is quite capable, or he's intelligent enough to see that that woman of his choice, that one says, not no choice, he had been captured. He sees that she's no good at all, that she's a hell of a business. And he tells me so. And he said, for God's sake, doctor, help me to get rid of that woman. He can't. He's like clay in her fingers. And that is the archetype. Freud is always inclined to explain these things by external influences.
Dr. Jung, we have been discussing some of the factors in the development of the personality of the individual, and you have very kindly elaborated for us on some of your fundamental concepts, such as the archetype and the anima and the animus. Now, another concept or idea that seems to be a very interesting one in your work is the persona. I wonder if you would mind telling us a little bit about how you construe this term persona.
Well, this is a practical concept we need in elucidating people's relation. I noticed with my patients, particularly with people that are in public life, that they have a certain way of presenting themselves. For instance, take the doctor. He has a certain way. For instance, he has good bedside manners, and He behaves as one expects a doctor behaves. He may even identify himself with it and believe that he is what he appears to be. He must appear in a certain form, unless people don't believe that he is a doctor. And so when he is a professor, he's also supposed to behave in a certain way so that it is plausible that he is a professor. So the persona is partially the result of the demands the society has. And on the other side, it is a compromise with what one likes to be, or with what, or as one likes to appear. So take, for instance, a parson. He also has his particular manner, and as corresponding to the general expectation, and he behaves also in another way, combined with his persona that is forced upon him by society in such a way that also is fiction of himself, his idea about himself is more or less portrayed or represented. So the persona is a certain complicated system of behavior which is partially dictated by society and partially dictated by the expectations or the wishes one nurses oneself. Now, this is not the real personality, in spite of the fact that people will assure that that is all quite real and quite honest, yet it is not. Now, such a performance, or the performance of the persona is quite all right as long as you know that you are not identical with the way in which you appear. But if you are unconscious of this fact, then you get into sometimes very disagreeable conflicts. Namely, people can't help noticing that at home, for instance, you are quite different from what you appear to be in public. And people who don't know it, they stumble over it in the end. If they deny that they are like that, but they are like that. They are it. And then you don't know, now, which is the real man? Is he the man as he is at home or in intimate relations? Or is he the man that appears in public? It is a question of Jekyll and Hyde. Occasionally there is such a difference that you would almost be able to speak of double personality. And the more that is pronounced, the more people are neurotic. They get neurotic because they have two different ways. They contradict themselves all the time, and there's as much as they are unconscious of themselves. But they don't know it. They think they're all one. Everybody sees that they are two. And some know him only from one side, some others know him only from the other side. And then there are situations that clash, because if the way you are creates certain situations with people in your relations, and these two situations don't chime in, they are just dissonance. And the more that is the case, the more the people are neurotic.
Actually, would you say that the individual may even have more than two personas?
I mean, it can't afford it very well to play more than two roles. But there are cases, for instance, where people have up to 5 different personalities in cases of dissociation of personality, where, for instance, the one person, say, call it person A, doesn't know of the existence of the person B, but B knows of A. Or there may be a third personality, C, that doesn't know of the two others. There are such cases in literature, but they are rare. Very ordinary cases, it's just an ordinary dissociation of a personality. One calls that a systematic dissociation, in contradistinction to the chaotic or unsystematic dissociation you find in schizophrenia.
What is the difference between the term ego, as you see it, and the term will?
You see, the ego is supposed to be the representative of the real person. For instance, in the case where B knows of A, but A doesn't know of B, in that case, one would say the ego is more on the side of B, because the ego has a more complete knowledge, and A is a split of personality.
You also use the term self. Would this have a different meaning than, say, ego or?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You see, when I say self, then you mustn't think of I, myself, because that is only your empirical self, and that is covered by the term ego. But when it is matter of the self, then it is matter of a personality that is more complete than the ego, because the ego is only consists of what you are conscious of, what you know to be yourself. For instance, in our example, B that knows A, and A doesn't know B, B is relatively in the position of the self. Namely, the self is on the one side the ego, on the other side the unconscious personality, which is in the possession of everybody. Very often it's just the other way around, that the unconscious is in possession of consciousness. But that is a different case. Now, you see, while I am talking, I am conscious of what I say, I am conscious of myself, yet only to a certain extent. Quite a lot of things happen. For instance, I make gestures. I'm not conscious of them. They happen unconsciously. You can see them. I may say or use words, and I can't remember at all having used those words, or even at the moment I'm not conscious of them. So, any amount of unconscious things occur in my conscious condition. I'm never wholly conscious of myself. While I'm trying, for instance, to elaborate an argument, at the same time, there are unconscious processes that continue, perhaps a dream, which I had last night, or a part of myself thinks of God knows what, or of a trip I'm going to take, or of such and such people I have seen, or when I am at writing a paper, I am continuing writing that paper in my mind without knowing it. You can discover these things, say, in dreams, or if you are clever in immediate observation of an individual, then you see in the gestures or in the expression in the face that there is what one calls an arrière-pensée, something behind conscious, so that you have finally the feeling, that man has something up his sleeve. And you can even ask him now, what are you really thinking? You're thinking all the time something else, yet he's not conscious of it. Or he may be. There are, of course, great individual differences. There are individuals who have amazing knowledge of themselves, of the things that go on in themselves. But even those people wouldn't be capable of knowing what is going on in their unconscious. For instance, they are not conscious of the fact that while they live a conscious life, all the time a myth is played in the unconscious. A myth that extends over centuries, namely archetypal ideas, a stream of archetypal ideas that goes on through one individual, through the centuries. And that comes then to the daylight in the great movements, say in political movements or in spiritual movements. For instance, in the time before Reformation, people dreamt of the great change. And that's the reason why such great transformations could be predicted. If somebody has been clever enough to see what there is going on in people's mind, in the unconscious mind, would be able to predict it. For instance, I have predicted the Nazi rising in Germany through the observation of my German patients.
Yes.
They had dreams in which the whole thing was anticipated, and with considerable detail. And I was already absolutely certain in the years before Hitler came in the beginning of the, well, I could say the year 1919, I was sure that something was threatening in Germany, something very big and very catastrophic. And I only knew it through the observation of the unconscious. You see, there is something very particular in the different nations. This is a peculiar fact that the archetype of the anima plays a very great role in Western literature, French and Anglo-Saxon, not in Germany. There are exceedingly few examples in German literature where the anima plays a role.
Yes.
That's it becomes of the fact that not one woman is buried unless she's buried as Alt-Kaminfegerskaffee, at least. She must have a title, otherwise she hasn't existed.
Okay.
And so, you see, it is just as if, now mind you, this is a bit drastic, but it illustrates my point. In Germany, there are no women. There is Frau Doktor, Frau Professor, Frau Kommerzienrat, the grandmother, the mother-in-law, the grandfather, father, the son, the daughter, the sister, la femme. So next is the plot. Well, it is the idea, you see. Now that is an enormously important fact, which shows that in the German mind, there is going on a particular myth, something very particular. And psychologists really should look out for these things. But they prefer to think that I'm a prophet.
Ha! Now, this is, of course, a very interesting, remarkable set of statements here. How would you look at Hitler in this light? Would you see him as a personification, a symbol of the father?
Oh, well, no. Not at all. No, you see, I couldn't possibly explain that very complicated fact Hitler represents. It is too complicated, you know. He's a hero figure. And the hero figure is far more important than any fathers that have ever existed. Only was a hero, in the German myth. Mind you, a religious hero. He was a savior. He was meant to be a savior. That is why they put his photo upon the altars, even. Or somebody declared this too, so that he is happy to that his eyes have beheld Hitler, and now he kept dying in peace. Oh, he's just the hero myth, you know.
Now, getting back to the idea of the self incorporates these unconscious.
The self is really a term that designates the whole personality, because the whole personality of man is indescribable. His consciousness can be described. His unconscious cannot be described, because the unconscious, as I must repeat myself, is always unconscious. And he is really unconscious. He really does not know it. And so we don't know our unconscious personality. We have hints, we have certain ideas, but we don't know it really. Nobody can say where man ends. And that is the beauty of it, you know. It's very interesting. The unconscious of man can reach God knows where. There we are going to make discoveries.
Now, another set of ideas, which of course are very, very well known to the world, that of course you have originated, center around the terms introversion and extroversion.
Yeah.
And I know that you're aware of the fact that these terms have now become so widely known that the man on the street is using these terms constantly, describing his wife or his friends and so on and so forth. It's become probably the most used psychological concept by the layman that we have.
Like the word complex. I have invented it too.
Yeah, so that's
association experiment.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you see, this is simply practical, because there are certain people who definitely are more influenced by their surroundings than by their own intentions. While there are other people who are more influenced by the subjective factor. Now you see, the subjective factor, that's very characteristic, was understood by Freud as a sort of pathological or autoerotism. Now this is a mistake. The psyche has two important conditions. The one is the environmental influence,
Yes.
and the other is the given fact of the psyche as it is born. The psyche is by no means tabula rasa. We have a definite mixture and combination of genes.
Yeah.
And they are there from the very first moment of our life. And they give a definite character, even to the little child. And that is a subjective factor, looked at from the outside. Now, if you look at it from the inside, then it is just so as if you would observe the world. When you observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see growing images, a world of images, generally known as fantasies. Yet these fantasies are facts. You see, it is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life. Or a bridge is built. These houses were all fantasies. Everything you do here, all of the houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And the fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact, nevertheless. It is, a form of energy. Despite the fact we can't measure it. It is a manifestation of something. And that is a reality that is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that. It is no more, you can't show it. But it has been a fact. And so the psychic events are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world within. Because the psyche, if you understand it as a phenomenon that takes place in so-called living bodies, then it is a quality of matter. As our body consists of matter, we discovered that this matter has another aspect, namely a psychic aspect. So it is simply the world from within, seen from within. It is just as if we were seeing into another aspect of matter. It is an idea that is not my invention, that the old Democritus already said, talked of the spiritus insertus atomis, namely the spirit that is inserted in atoms. That means psyche is a quality that appears in matter. Doesn't matter whether we understand it or not, but this is the conclusion we come to if we draw conclusions without prejudice. And so, you see, the man who is going by the external world, by the influence of the external world, say society or perceptions, sense perceptions, thinks that he is more valid, because this is valid, this is real. And the man who goes by the subjective fact is not valid because subjective factor is nothing. Yeah. No, that man is just as well based because he is based himself upon the world from within. And so he is quite right, even if he says, there is nothing but my fantasy, And of course, that is the introvert. And that the introvert is always afraid of the external world. He will tell you, when you ask him, he will be apologetic about it.
Yeah.
He will say, of course, yes, I know, all my fantasies. And he has always a resentment. and as the world in general, particularly America, is extroverted like hell, and the introvert has no place, because he doesn't know that he beholds the world from within.
Yeah.
And that gives him dignity, and that gives him certainty, because it is nowadays particularly the world hangs on a thin thread.
Yeah.
And that is the psyche of man. Assume that certain fellows in Moscow lose their nerve or their common sense for a bit. And the whole world is in environment and flames. Nowadays, we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an age bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche? It is demonstrated to us in our days what the power psyche is of man. How important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it. Nobody would give credit to the idea that the psychical processes of the ordinary man have any importance whatever. One thinks, he has just what he has in his head. It is all from his surrounding, his thought, such a thing. And particularly if he's well housed, well fed, then he has no idea of them. That's the great mistake. Because he is just that as which he is born, and he is not born as tabula rasa, but as a reality.
Now, of course, one of the very common, I think, misconceptions of your work among some of the writers of America had been that they had sort of characterized your discussions of introversion and extroversion as suggesting that the world was made up of only two kinds of people, introverts on one hand and extroverts on the other. Would you like to comment about that?
Bismarck once said, God may protect me against my friends. With my enemies, I can deal myself alone. We know how people are. They catch a word, and then everything is schematized along that word. There is no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. Such a man would be the lunatic asylum. Those are only terms to designate a certain penchant, a certain tendency, versus the tendency to be more influenced by environmental influences or more influenced by the subjective type. That's all. And you see, there are people who are fairly well balanced and are just as much influenced from within as they are from without, just as little. And so with all the finer classifications, they are only a sort of point de repère, points for orientation. My whole scheme of typology is merely a sort of orientation. Namely, there is such a factor as introversion, there is such a factor as extroversion. The classification of individuals means nothing at all. This is only the instrumentarium for the practical psychologists to explain, for instance, a husband to a wife or vice versa. For instance, it is very often the case, one could almost say, it is almost the rule, but I don't want to make too many wrong, in order not to be schematic, that an introvert marries an extrovert for compensation, or another type marries the counter type to complement himself, for instance.
Dr. Jung, of course, tied in with your typology and quotation marks of introversion and extroversion, we first know of your concepts of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And, of course, we'd be very interested to hear some expansion of the meaning of these particular terms as related to the introvert-extrovert dichotomy.
Well, there is quite a simple explanation of these terms, and it shows at the same time how I arrived at such a typology. Namely, the sensation tells you that there is something. Thinking, roughly speaking, tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not, to be accepted or not accepted or rejected. And intuition out there is a difficulty. You don't know ordinarily how intuition works. So when a man has a hunch, you can't tell exactly how he got at that hunch or where that hunch comes from. It is something funny about intuition. I will tell you a little story. I had two patients, but the man was a sensation type and the woman was an intuitive type. Of course, they felt attraction. And so they took a little boat and went out to the Lake of Zurich. And there were those birds that die off the fish, you know. And then after a certain time they come up again and you can't tell where they come up. And so they began to bid who was the first to see the bird. Now, you would think that the one who observes reality very carefully, the sensation type, would of course win out. Not at all. The woman won the bet completely. She was beating him on all points. Because by intuition she knew it before. Now, how is that possible? Well, sometimes, you know, you can really find out how it works by finding the intermediate links. You see, it is a perception by intermediate links, and you only get the result of that whole chain of association. Sometimes you succeed in finding out, but more often you don't. So my definition is, intuition is a perception by ways or means of the unconscious. That is as near as I can get. Now, this is a very important function, because when you live under primitive conditions, a lot of unpredictable things are likely to happen. And there you need your intuition, because you cannot possibly tell by your perceptions, by your sense perceptions, what is going to happen. For instance, you are standing in primeval forest. You only see for a few steps ahead. You go by the compass, perhaps, and you don't know what there is ahead. It is uncharted country. If you use your intuition, then you have hunches. And when you live under such primitive conditions, you instantly are aware of hunches. For instance, there are places that are favorable, there are places that are not favorable. You can't tell by your life what it is, but you better follow these hunches. Because anything can happen. Quite unforeseen things. For instance, at the end of a long day, you approach a river, and you don't know that there is a river. Yet, when you come to the river, that is quite unexpected. For miles, there is no human habitation. You cannot swim across. It's all full of crocodiles. So what? You see? Now, such an obstacle hasn't been foreseen. But it may be that you have had a hunch, that you remained in the last likely spot, and that you wait for the following day, that you can build a raft or something of the sort, or look out for possibilities. For instance, you also can have intuitions that constantly happens in our jungle called a city. You can have a hunch, something is going wrong, particularly when you are driving an automobile. For instance, it is a day where nurses appear in the street. And they always try to get something interesting like a suicide, to be run over. That's marvelous, apparently. And then, you get a peculiar feeling. And really, at the next corner already is a second nurse that's runs in front of the automobile. Multiplicity of cases, that is a rule, that such chance happenings come in groups. And so you see, we have constantly warnings, hints that consist perhaps in a slight feeling of uneasiness or uncertainty, fear. Now, on the primitive circumstances, you will pay attention to these things. They mean something. With us in our man-made, absolutely, apparently safe conditions, we don't need that function so very much. Yet we still use it. So you find that intuitive types, for instance, amongst bankers, Wall Street men, the day for lunches, gamblers of all descriptions. You find the type very frequently among doctors because it helps them in their prognosis. Sometimes a case can look quite normal, as it were, and you don't foresee any complications. Yet, an inner voice tells you, now look out, here is something not quite all right, You cannot tell why and how, but we have a lot of subliminal perceptions, sense perceptions, and from those we probably draw a good deal of our intuitions, but that is perception by the way of the unconscious. And we've got to observe that with intuitive types. You see, intuitive types very often do not perceive by their eyes or by their ears. They perceive by intuition. For instance, once it happened that I had a woman patient in the morning at 9 o'clock. And you see, I often smoke my pipe, you saw the smell of tobacco in the room or a cigar. And so she came and said, but you begin early. I said, couldn't you call it early at 9 o'clock? But no, you must have seen somebody at 8 o'clock. I said, how do you know? There had been a man there that had come at 8 o'clock already. Then she said, oh, well, I had just a hunch. There must have been a gentleman with you this morning. I said, how do you know it was a gentleman? He said, oh, well, I just had the impression, the atmosphere, it was just like a gentleman. All the time, the ashtray was under her nose, and there was a half-smoked cigar. But she wouldn't notice it. So you see, the intuitive is the type that doesn't see the stumbling block before his feet. But he's at for 10 miles.
You make a distinction between an intuitive extrovert and an intuitive introvert. For example, more specifically, what would be an example or a difference between an intuitive extrovert and an intuitive introvert?
Well, you have chosen a somewhat difficult case, because one of the most difficult types is the intuitive introvert.
Yeah.
The intuitive extrovert, you find them all hunters, bankers.
Yeah.
That is quite understandable. Yeah. But the introvert is is more difficult because he has intuitions as to the subjective factor, namely the inner world. And of course, that is now very difficult to understand, because what he sees are most uncommon things, and he doesn't like to talk of them.
Yeah.
If he's not a fool, because he would spoil his own game by telling what he sees, because people won't understand it. For instance, once I had a patient, a young woman, about 27 or 8, and her first words were, when I had seated her, He said, you know, doctor, I come to you because I have a snake in my abdomen. I said, what? Yes, a snake, a black snake, coiled up right in the bottom of my abdomen. And I must have made a rather bewildered face. I said, you know, I don't mean it literally, but I should say it was a snake. It was a snake. Now, you see, our further conversation a little later, that was about in the middle of our treatment that only lasted for 10 consultations. She had foretold me, I got 10 times, and then it's all right. I said, how do you know? Oh, I got a hunch, she said. And really, about the 5th or 6th hour, she said, doctor, I must tell you, the snake has risen. It is now about here. Punch. And then, on the 10th day, I said, now, this is our last hour. And do you feel cured? And she said, beaming, she said, you know, this warning, it came up and came out of my mouth, and the head was golden. And those were her last words. Now, you see, that same girl, when it comes to reality, she came to me because she couldn't hear the step of my feet anymore, because she walked on air, literally. She couldn't hear it. That frightened her. And when she came to me, I asked her for her address. And then she said, oh, pension so-and-so. When it is not just called pension, but it is a sort of pension. I never had heard of it. Now, I'm curious, I never have heard of that place. Well, it's a very nice place, she said. You're curious enough, there are only young girls there, very nice and very lively young girls. And they have a merry time. I often wish they would invite me to their merry evenings. And I said, but, well, they amuse themselves all alone. Oh, no, there are plenty of young gentlemen coming in, and they have a beautiful time, but they never invite me. It turned out that it was a private bottle. I said, she was perfectly decent girl, you know, of a very good family. Not from here. She had found that place. I don't know how. And she was totally unaware that they were all prostitutes. I said, for heaven's sake, you fell into a very dark place. You hastened to get out of it. You see, that was her sensation. Yeah. She didn't see reality, but she had hunches like anything, and there came more. Now, you see, such a person cannot possibly speak of her experiences, because everybody would think she's absolutely crazy. Yeah, I myself was quite shocked when I thought, for heaven's sake, is that case a schizophrenia? Yeah, because you don't hear that kind of speech. But she assumed that the old man, of course, knows everything, and he even doesn't understands such kind of language. So you see, if the introverted intuitive would speak what he really perceives, then back and over to the other side, you would be misunderstood. And so they learn to keep things to themselves, and you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. That is a great disadvantage, but it is an enormous advantage in another way. Not to speak of the experience they encounter in that respect, but also in human relations. For instance, they come into the presence of somebody they don't know, and certainly they have inner images. And these inner images give them a more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner. You know, that is, but the case can also happen that they come into the presence of somebody who they don't know at all, not from Adam, and they know an important piece out of the biography of that person, and are not aware of it. So the introverted intuitive has, in a way, a very difficult life, although one of the most interesting lives.
Yeah.
But it is difficult often to get into the confidence,
Yeah, because you say they're afraid that people will think they think.
The things that are interesting to them or are vital to them are utterly strange to the ordinary individual. But the psychologist should know of such things, you see. When people make psychology as a psychologist what to do, well, the very first question is he extroverted or is he introvert?
Yeah.
If we look at entirely different things, is he a sensation type? Is he an intuitive type? Is he thinking? Is he feeling? Because you see, these things are complicated, that they are still more complicated because the introverted thinker, for instance, is compensated by extroverted feeling or by inferior extroverted, archaic extroverted feeling. So an introverted thinker may be very crude in his feeling, like, for instance, the introverted philosopher that is always carefully avoiding women will be married by his cook in the end.
Now, then, in other words, then we can take your introvert, extrovert categories and, in a sense, go through describing a sensation introvert type, sensation extrovert type, faking introvert type, faking introvert type, and so on. At each case, and it stems from really not real category, but simply, as you say, an approach, something to sort of help us study, a model.
It is just a sort of a skeleton to which you have to add the flesh, or say it is a country mapped out, by triangulation points, and that doesn't mean the country consists of triangulation points. That is only in order to have an idea of the distances, and so it is a means to an end. It only makes sense such a scheme when you deal with practical cases.
Of course, you're familiar with the work of Dr. J.B. Ryan at Duke.
Yes.
And, of course, some of his work in extrasensory perception and clairvoyance, mental telepathy, so on and so forth. Some of the descriptions sound quite a bit like intuitive function operating. And in terms of your knowledge of this work, would you say that the person who has clairvoyance, in a sense, would then be an intuitive type?
That's quite probable. Or it can be a sensation type, say an extroverted sensation type that is very much influenced by the unconscious.
I see.
Because he has introverted intuition in his unconscious. You see, there are two groups, the rational group and the irrational group. The rational group is thinking and feeling, because the ideal thinking is a rational result, the rational values. That is differentiated feeling. Whereas sensation must needs be irrational, because it may not prejudice facts. You see, it shall not prejudice facts. The real ideal perception is that you have an accurate perception of the things as they are, without addition or correction. On the other side, the intuition does not look at the things as they are. That is prison, that is anathema to the intuition. It looks, ever so shortly at the things as they are, and makes off into an unconscious process, at the end of which we have seen something nobody else would have seen. Now, so you see these people who yield the best results are always those people where introverted or introverted intuition comes in. But you see, that is side aspect of it. It's not interesting. There's another question, far more interesting, namely that the terms they use for Heine himself uses recognition, etc. They mean nothing at all. They're words, but he thinks he has said something when he says telepathy. That's nothing.
Now, of course, a lot of the things that you're describing, I think often scientists will say, well, this is due to chance occurrences, chance factors. And Ryan, in his own work, used statistical methods. We find this happening more often than would be affected by chance.
Well, you see, he proves that it is more than chance. It is statistically causable. And that is the important point. And that hasn't been contradicted.
Yeah.
You see, there was such a poor that happened in England. The man said, "Oh, well, that's nothing but guesswork." Exactly. Yeah, guessing. It is guessing. What you call guessing, a hunch is guessing. A definite guess, is a hunch, Just that. But that means nothing. You see, the point is that it is more than merely probable. It is not. It is beyond chance. And that is the great problem. But, people hate such problems. They can't deal with.
And so not concrete. They're not in front of them.
They can't deal with it. Even Ryan doesn't understand our argument in that respect. Because it is a relativation. Now I'm going to say something which in these sacred rooms is anathema. A relativation of time and space through psyche. That's the fact. And that is what Wright has made evident. Now swallow that.
Well, that's difficult. Well, may I go a little further and for some of your recent work, which is indeed very profound, and it is not too well known to many of our students as yet.
Of course not. Nobody reads these things. Only the general public. Because my books are at least sold.
I'm referring now to the concept of synchronicity, which you have discussed, and which would have some relevance at this point in our discussion. Would you care to comment a little bit on this concept?
That is awfully complicated, and one wouldn't know where to begin. Of course, it is this kind of thinking has been started long ago, and when Ryan brought out these results, I thought now we have at least a more or less dependable basis to argue on, but the argument was not understood at all, because it's really very, very difficult. There are plenty of facts in the observation of the unconscious where you will come across cases of a very peculiar type of parallel events, namely that, say, I have a certain thought or a certain definite subject is occupying my attention, my interest. At the same time, something else, quite independently, happens that portrays just that thought. Now, this is utter nonsense, looked at from a causal point of view. That it is not nonsense is made evident by the results of Wright's experiments. There is a probability, it is something more than chance, that such a case occurs. Now I never made statistical experiments except one in the way of Wright for another purpose. But I have come across quite a number of cases where it was most astounding to find that two causal chains happened at the same time, but independent upon each other, so that you could say they have nothing to do with each other. Of course, it's quite clear. For instance, just so I speak of a red car, and at that moment a red car comes here. Now, I hadn't seen it. It was impossible because it was behind the building. In this moment, the red car appears. Now, this was a that's mere chance. The Reis experiment proves that these cases are not mere chance. Of course, many of these things are occurrences where we cannot apply such an argument. Otherwise, we would be superstitious. We can't say, now this car has appeared because here was some remarks have been made about the red car.
It's not cause and effect.
This is a miracle that a red car appears. It is not, it is chance, just chance. But these chances happening more often than chance allows. And that shows that there is something behind it. So we see in WWII has a whole institute and with many co-workers. And as the means, we have no means here, to make such an experiments. Otherwise, I probably would have done them. But this just was physically impossible. So I had to content myself with the observation of facts.
The sort of question that is so important as we try to understand the individual, and this centers around the problem of motivation, why the person does what he does. Now, to a great degree, you've already talked about this when you talked about archetypes. Now, in the work of Dr. Freud, he spoke of libido as an energy, and earlier we spoke of libido and the fact that you felt that it was more than just sexual energy. You thought it to be something much broader. Now, you have certain principles about psychic energy which are indeed very provocative. Now, one of the principle, I believe you referred to as the principle of entropy.
Well, only I allude to it. The main point is, the standpoint of energetics as applied to psychical phenomena. There you have no possibility to measure exactly. So it always remains a sort of an analogy. Freud, for instance, uses the term libido in the sense of a sexual energy. And that is not quite correct. You see, if it is sexual, then it is a power, like electricity, any other form of manifestation of energy. Now, energy is a concept. Energy is a concept by which you try to express the analogy of all power manifestations, namely that they have a certain quantity, a certain intensity, and that there is a flow in one direction, namely to the ultimate suspension of the opposites. For instance, the real high lake on a mountain flows down until all the water is down, and then it is finished. And so we see something similar is the case in psychology, that you see from the fact that we get tired from intellectual work. We have come from consciously living, and then we must breathe in order to restore our power. And it's just, I said in the night of I think the water have come from the lower water to higher level. You also can work again the next day. That similar is linking too. There it is only in an analogous way that we use the term energy. And I used it because I wanted to express the fact that the power manifestation of sexuality is not the only power manifestation, because you have a lot of time say, the drive to conquer, or drive to aggression, or something of the sort. There are many theories, you see, for just to take animals, the way they are building their nest, the urge of the traveling bird, that migrates. They are driven by a sort of energy manifestation. You see, the meaning of the word sexuality would be entirely gone if everything is that. So Freud himself saw that this is not applicable everywhere, and later he corrected himself by assuming that there are also ego drive. You see, now that is something else. That's another manifestation. Now, in order not to presume or to prejudice things, I speak simply of energy. An energy. It is a quality of energy that can manifest via sexuality or via any other type of drive. And that is the main creature, not the existence of their single power, because that is not wrongable.
Now, another thing about a motivation or the condition which arouse or direct and sustain the individual, it seems to be two views that we find in much of our psychology in America today. Now, one is might be called an historical view, where we try to look in the history and development of the individual for answers to why he is doing certain things at the moment. Then we have another view, which was postulated and discussed by Dr. Kurt Lewin, which is sort of a field theory. He thinks that the history, the past, is not important motivation, but all conditions which affect the individual at that moment. We predict behavior by knowing the conditions at that moment, but we don't have to go back to the past to understand why the person does what he does. Now, you think that this present field idea of Dr. Lewin has any virtue? Does it?
Well, obviously, you see, I always insist that even chronic neurosis has its true cause in the moment. Now, the diagnosis is made every day by the wrong attitude the individual has. But that wrong attitude is a historical fact that needs to be explained historically by things that have happened in the past. But that is one-sided too, because all psychological facts are oriented not only to a cause, but also to a certain value. They are in a way teleological, namely, they serve a certain purpose. And so, one attitude can have originated in a certain way, never goal, but it wouldn't exist today anymore if there were not immediate causes and immediate purposes that keep it alive today. So a neurosis can be finished suddenly on a certain day, despite of all causes. In the beginning of the war, the cases of compulsion neurosis that have lasted for many years suddenly were cured because they got into an entirely new condition. It is like a shock. You see that with shock. Even the schizophrenia can be vastly improved by a shock, because that's a new condition. It is a very shocking thing that shocks them out of their habitual attitude, and then they are normal in it, and then the whole thing collapses. The whole system that has been built up for years.
So in therapy, in working with a patient, you would not say that it's absolutely imperative to have to reformulate all of the past life in order to help him with his present neurosis. You feel that you could deal with him at the moment with his problem as it is at this time, that it's not necessary to go back and probe into things that happened to him during his third year of life.
You see, there is no system about it in therapy. In therapy, you treat the patient as he is in the present moment, irrespective of causes and such things. That is all more or less workable. there are cases who know just as much about their own neurosis as I know about it, in a way. In such cases, I can start right away with posing the problem. For instance, there is a case, a professor of philosophy, and he imagines that he has cancer. And he shows me several dozen X-ray plates that prove that there is no cancer. He says, of course I have no cancer. But nevertheless, I'm afraid I could have one. I have consulted so many surgeons, and they all assure me there is none. And I know there is none. Therefore, I might have one, you see, and that's enough. Now, you see, such a case can stop from one moment to the other. He simply stops thinking such a foolish thing. But that is exactly what he cannot do. And in such a case, I say, well, it's not a painting, it's nonsense what you believe. Now, why are we forced to believe such nonsense? What is the power that makes you think such a thing against your free will? You know it is nonsense, and why should you think it? Or what purpose do you think it? Well, and what is that power that makes you think such a thing? It's like a possession, you know. Exactly, like a demon, and then lives in things like that, in spite of the fact that he doesn't want it. Then you have the problem. That is the problem of an intellectual man. And then I say, now, you see, you don't know, you have no answer. I have no answer. Now what are we going to do? Now we will see what you mean, because the dream is a manifestation of the unconscious side. And I never had thought of the unconscious side. So I must explain to him that he has an unconscious, and that the dream is a manifestation of it. And if we succeed in analyzing the dream, we might get an idea about that, how if that makes him think like that. You see? So, in such a case, one can begin right away with the analysis of the dream. And in all cases that are a bit serious, mind me, this is not a simple case. It's very here and a difficult case. In spite of the simplicity of the phenomenology, of the symptomatology. In all cases, after the interface, as it were, the history of the family, the medical analysis, etc., we come to that question. What is it in your unconscious that makes you wrong? And that hinders you to think normally? And then we are there where we can begin with the observation of the unconscious. And then day by day, one goes on by the data the unconscious produces. Then we discuss the dream, and that gives a new surface to the whole problem. And if we have another dream, and then the next dream gives again an answer, because the unconscious is in a compensated relation to consciousness, and after a while we get the full picture. And if he has a full picture and has the necessary mental stamina, well, then he can be cured. But in the end, it is a moral question whether a man applies what he has learned or not.
So you see then, in a sense, in this situation, the unconscious plays a very important part. But if you see it then, what you have found in the dream is not necessarily then a image or symbol of what has happened in the past in his particular life.
Oh, it is just the symbol. You see, that is a special term. It is the manifestation of the situation of the unconscious, looked at from the unconscious. I tell you, for instance, something which is my personal or subjective view. And if I ask myself, now, are we really quite convinced of it? Well, I must admit, I have certain doubts. There are certain doubts. Not in the moment, then I tell you, but these doubts are in the unconscious, and then I have a dream about it. it starts to come to the forefront in my dream. And that is the way the unconscious looks at the thing. It is just so as if the unconscious will say, yes, that's all what you are stating, that you omit entirely such and such a point.
Now, if the unconscious acts on its present situation, looking at this in broad motivational terms, now this, the theft of the unconscious is not something which is a result of repression in the same way the orthodox psychoanalysts at it all, and as you
know, it may be that what the unconscious has to say is so disagreeable that one prefers not to listen. And in most cases, people would be probably less neurotic if they could admit the things, these things of, it's a bit difficult, or when you have disagreement, or inconvenient, or so they have to sort. So there is always a certain amount of repression, but that is not the main thing. Not the main thing is that they are really unconscious. And you see, if you are unconscious about certain things that ought to be conscious, then you're dissociated. And then you are a man whose left hand never knows what the right is doing, and counteracts or interferes with the right hand. Now such a man is hampered all over the place. Would there be a great deal of equivalence between the unconscious of a particular individual who's been raised in one culture and another individual who was raised in an entirely different culture? Well, you see, that question is also complicated, because when we speak of the unconscious, we almost should say which unconscious, namely, is it that personal unconsciousness which is characteristic for a certain person, for a certain individual.
So that you have the personal unconscious. This is one unconscious personal unconscious. And you call it the personal.
And in treatment, for instance, in the treatment of neurosis, you have to do with that personal unconscious for quite a while. And then only dreams come that show that the collective unconscious is touched upon. As long as there is material for personal nature, you have to deal with the personal unconscious. But when you get to a question, to a problem, which is not merely personal, but also collective, you get collective thinking.
Now, the distinction then between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious then is that the personal could be more involved with the immediate life of the individual.
Well, for instance, every society has collective problems, collective convictions, and so on. Now, we are very much influenced by them. Whether you belong to a certain political party or to a certain confession. And that can be a serious determinant of your behavior. Now, as long as your personal conflict doesn't touch upon it, it's no question, it doesn't appear. But the moment you transcend your personal sphere and come to your unpersonal impermanence, say to the question, a political question, or any other social question, which really matters to you, then you are confronted with a collective problem, and then you have collective feeling.
I wonder if it would be too presumptuous of me to ask if you could, for the moment, think of an actual case of perhaps a patient or a friend in which you might show us how the personal and the collective unconscious were acting, say, his neurosis, or perhaps in a problem that he may have.
Well, you see, there is an enormous amount of personal dreams, for instance, with the fact how your relation is to your father, or to your mother, or to your wife, and so on, with all sorts of individual variations. Now, suppose a patient comes to that level, or that his conflict begins to become really very serious, so that his mind might suffer. Then he can have a collective dream in which clearly mythological motives appear. Now, there are plenty of examples in what you write a book, an introduction to psychology of the unconscious. There are such dreams. I remember, for instance, about a very learned man and very rational. And he had, of course, a lot of personal problems. And they got so bad that he got into a very evil relations to his whole surroundings. He was, for instance, a member of a society, and he got into a war with the people of that society, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and it was very quite shocking. Now, he started this collective dream. Suddenly he dreamt of things he had never thought of in his life before. He's a lot in the bottle, and he thought he was crazy. Because he could not understand it at all. And he thought, just as if the whole world were God's car. Now that is what you see in cases of schizophrenia. But you take that case of schizophrenia. As examples, you can take any of these collective dreams I published. To make it clear, I should tell a long story, and then you see where it applies, or otherwise it makes no sense, and then something short. Yeah, I agree with that case of that intuitive world. Yeah. Suddenly came out with the statement that she had a black snake in the bed. Yeah. Well, now, that is a collective symbol. That is not an individual fantasy. That is a collective fantasy. Yeah. That is well known in India. Well, she had nothing to do with India, but we have it too. It was similarly human. That's a entirely unknown. So, I, even in the first moment, thought, perhaps she's crazy. But she was only highly individual. And it is in India known, and it is the basis of a whole kind of system of tantalism. This is Kundalini. Now, Kundalini is certain, I think, you see? And that is something known to some few specialists. Generally, it's not known that we have a certain in the abdomen. But that is a collective, you see? That is a collective dream, or collective fantasy. Yeah.
Now, when bodies are living, the individual, is it possible that things that trouble them and cause tension, that he represses? Now, these things that he represses will become part of the personal unconscious. Part of the personal unconscious.
Yes. He doesn't think that consciously always. These things disappear.
Yeah.
They disappear. And Freud explains that by an act of repression. But you can prove that these things never have been conscious before. They simply don't appear. And you don't know why they don't appear. Of course, available, you can say, when it comes up, you say, that is why they didn't appear, because they were either compatible with the cortical use, with the cortical attitude. But that is afterwards. You couldn't predict it. And so you see, these things that have an emotional plane, they are actually autonomous, so that they can appear or they can't not appear. They can disappear at wish, not of the subject, but of their own. Well, you also kind of repress them. It is so the same is with projections. For instance, people say, one makes projections. It's nonsense. What doesn't make them? One finds them. That all of them there is here not conscious, but there is conscious. In my brother, I see the beam of my eye as a splinter in my brother's eye. And that is right there because I am conscious of the beam in my eye. You know, the projections are not made. And so these disappearances or so-called impressions are just like projections. They, instead of being projected into somebody or into something outside, they are introjected. They are in your control.
Already impacted, I see.
But you are not the one that is doing it. There are cases, sure, but I should say the majority of cases are rule impressions. That was my first point of litigation with I saw in the association experiment that certain complexes are quite certainly not repressed. They simply don't appear. Yeah. Because the unconscious is real. It is an entity. It rises by itself. It is autonomy.
So, in a sense, when looking at the so-called defense mechanisms that the orthodox psychoanalysts speak of, like projection, rationalization, and so on and so forth, then, in a sense, where you would differ from the orthodox psychoanalytic view, you would not say then that they are a repressed type of way of defending a manner in which the ego is being defended, but rather you would say that they were already there. Yes. They're simply a manifestations of patterns that are already present in the unconscious.
Yes, and for instance, take that example of that serpent. That never has been repressed, otherwise it should have been conscious to her. It was exactly unconscious to her, and it only appeared in her purpose. It appeared spontaneously. She didn't know how she came to it. Yeah. Well, I just saw it.
Some of the orthodox psychoanalysts might have said that this was a phallic symbol.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, but you can't see anything, yeah. You can see a church spire is a phallic symbol. But when you dream of the peace, what is that? You know what the man is doing? One of the orthodox, the old God.
Yeah.
We say, in this case, the sensor has not functioned. Yeah. Now, we call that a scientific explanation.
Of course, you brought up many, many very interesting and provocative ideas here, as you have, of course, in your many, many thousands of pages of writing and written work. Would you like to comment a little bit upon this process of individuation, this process, how all these factors move toward a whole, a totality?
Well, that's something quite simple. Take an acorn, put it into the ground, it grows and it becomes an oak. You see, that is man. Man develops from an egg and develops into the whole man. And that is the law that is in him.
Well, when you spoke with Dr. Einstein in your early discussion, tried out some of his ideas on you, did you ever ask his opinion about the possibility that relativity might apply to psychic function? Did you ever discuss that particular point?
You know how it is. When a man is so concentrated upon his own idea, and when he is a mathematician on top of everything, then you're not welcome.
Yes, that's right. What year was it that you were friends with Einstein?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a friend. I was simply the old. And I tried to listen and to understand. And so there was little chance to insert some of my own ideas.
Was this after he'd already formulated the relativity theory, or just before?
It was just when he worked on it, right in the beginning. It was very interesting, very interesting.
In your dealings with Professor Toynbee, have you got rather interested in his ideas of history?
Oh, yes, you see his ideas about the life of civilizations. That is only by archetypal forms. And Toynbee has seen what I mean by the historical functioning of archetypal developments. See, that is a mighty important determinant of human behavior that lasts for centuries or for thousands of years and expresses itself in sequence. Sometimes singles you would see nothing at all. For instance, you know that Russia, the Soviet republics, have that symbol of the red star. Now, it's a five-red red star. America has the five-red white star. They are enemies. They can't come together. Now, in the Middle Ages, for about at least 2,000 years, the red and the white is the couple. that is ultimately based on the primary cover. And so America is a sort of matriarchy as much as most of the money is in the hands of women.
Yeah, right.
And Russia is the land of the little father. I think that's a patriarchy. And so it is father and mother, The white woman, in the middle, they call it the white woman, they bring in Abanita, and the servus rubius, the slave.
Well, it seems to be a very fundamental part of your writing and your ideas, and it's encased in the term Mandala.
Yeah.
Now, this seems to be sort of an ultimate realization, direction, and I would certainly be most interested in hearing your observations on this idea.
Well, Mandala is just one typical archetypal form. It is what they call it ultimately quadratura circuli, the square in the circle, or the circle in the square. And it is an age-old symbol that goes right back in the prehistory of man, and is all over the world. And it either expresses the deity or the soul. And in these two terms are psychologically very much related, which doesn't mean that I believe that God is a soul, or that the soul is God. I make that statement that there is a psychological relation, and that can have plenty of evidence for it. And it is a very important archetype. It's the archetype of an inner order. It is always used in that sense, either to make the arrangement of the many aspects of the universe, a world scheme, or the scheme of our psyche. And it expresses the fact that there is a center and a periphery. And it tries to embrace the whole. It's a symbol of wholeness. In a moment where, we should say, during a treatment, when there is good disorder and chaos in man's mind, then this symbol can appear as in the form of a mandala in a dream, or when you may imagine like a fantastical drawings or something of the sort. There is continuity affairs as a compensatory archetype, bringing order, showing the possibility of order, centeredness. And it is a center which is not coincident with the ego, but with the wholeness, we are wholeness, which I call the soul. This is the term of wholeness. And I not whole in my ego. My ego is a fragment of that personality. So you see, that the center of a mandala is not the ego. It is the whole personality, the whole self, the center of the whole personality. And it plays a very controlling English, for instance. But in the Middle Ages, equally. And then it has been lost, it has been thought of by the mere allegorical decorative motive. But in a matter of fact, it is a highly important and highly autonomous symbol that appears in dreams and so on, or in folklore. We usually say that the main archetype.
And speaking of this totality, which you say is very unified in the self, and of course, like you suggested here, there's the mandala with this very important archetype symbolizing this balance, I believe.
Yes.
Of course, sometimes we try in psychology to start from whatever totality does exist in the individual and try to sort of look into underlying motivation. And we have recently used a great deal of certain type of testing that we call projective tests. And as you've already suggested, and we all know, of course, very well, that you played a major role in developing this point of view with your word association method. What are the ingredients of the word association test? What is involved in the use of it?
You mean the practice?
Yes, the method for use of it, yes.
Well, you see, in the beginning, when I was a young man, of course, I was completely disoriented. Patience. I didn't know where to be, didn't know what to say. And the association at Front has given me the chance to offer accents to their cultures. I learned about the things that they not telling in. And I got a deep insight into the thing they did not know. And they discovered what they did.
Now, would you say that from responses, and as you say, complexes are sort of a myriad of loss? Of course, this word complex, I know, is the originator, if used very widely now.
You know, the diffuse between the complex, that is what I learned.
Now, you hope from these complexes or emotional blocks that you uncover as you administer this test to get at materials of the personal unconscious or the racial unconscious or all of the factors.
And no, in the beginning there was no pressing of no collective unconscious. Oh yeah, like that. It is chiefly the ordinary personal contact.
Yeah, I see. You weren't expecting to get it at that
hormone undersub complex associations where might appear an archetype element, but that wouldn't show particularly. You know, it is like a workshop, a superficial orientation.
You knew really large about, I believe, did you not?
No, he had circumvented me at not possible.
Yeah. But did you get to know him personally? No, you did not. I did not.
Absolutely.
And here, into the next pensive ideas, of course, in talking a great deal about your introversion and extroversion ideas.
I was an optimal because I had first said it is real, that is unpopular.
Well, you really didn't have any personal contact with Rosdok?
No personal contact.
Oh, I see. Are you familiar with this test?
Yes, sure. Yeah, no way. But I never applied it. Because later on, of course, I didn't apply the association test anymore because it wasn't necessary. I learned what I had to learn for the exact examination of exactly the reactions. I think it is a very excellent end.
Would you say, for example, that the practicing psychiatrist, the clinical psychologist, or the practicing psychiatrist could use the projective tests like the Freud
for the education of the typology? So the practical hypothesis meant to active work people, I think the best means to make me see how their brain will work.
Is that right? The projective test?
It seems very deductive. They can demonstrate the repression or amnestic phenomena, the way in which people cover their emotions and so on. It is like an ordinary conversation, but seen and measured in its principles. And that is really actually. You observe all the things you observe in the conversation. For instance, you ask people something, discuss certain things, and you observe little hesitations in the state of speech, certain gestures, all that comes to the foreground. And measurable, you know, in the experiment. I think I don't overrate the deductive value of it. I think very highly of it. There's a seizure, the interpretation of Jung and Aion. Or if I had a case that doesn't want to be called, I can make the experiment, but I find out a lot of things through the experiment. I have, of course, discovered the murder.
Is that right?
Oh,
would you like to tell us a little bit more how this done? Yeah.
Well, that is the association test. I worked out the example of the likely phenomenon. And we have done a lot of work on the camera map. We show the decrease of the volume of 3D and the difference of combat. that is one of the reasons of tuberculosis that arises from such a condition. People have a very shallow breathing, don't ventilate the irises of the lungs anymore, and get the tuberculosis. Half of the tuberculosis are psychic.
Of course, this matter of psychic tubercular cases and so on gets us into a particularly interesting special case of motivation that we're talking a lot about in the United States today, and I'm sure that if you also listen to the whole area of psychosomatic medicine.
Actually, quite a lot of studying cures of tuberculosis. Yeah, this tuberculosis where people learn to breathe again. But it wouldn't have helped if they had learned to breathe normally. That wouldn't have helped. But understanding what the complexes was, that has helped them.
When did you first become interested in these psychic factors of tuberculosis?
I was an analyst to begin with. I was always interested. Yeah, actually. Because I understood so little of it. Or I noticed that they understood so little.
This is very much the heart of a lot of our thinking today, the area that we call psychosomatic medicine.
Yes, sir.
Where we are now, right now, becoming more and more interested in the very thing you're saying, how the emotional, how these unconscious personality factors can actually have an effect on the body.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the classic examples in the United States in the past have been, for example, the peptic ulcer.
Yeah.
Where they believe this is the case of one of these emotional factors that actually created pathology in the body. And, of course, we've extended these ideas into many other areas. We, for example, feel that where there already is pathology, that these emotional factors can intensify it. Not only can it create it, but it can intensify existing pathology. Or sometimes there may be actually extensive to the pathology without the pattern. Now, for example, many of our physicians, or as you say, alienists in America, say that 60 or 70% of their patients are not individuals who have anything that really physically is wrong with them, but they have disorders that are of psychosomatic origin.
Yeah, that's well known.
Well, yeah.
Known since more than 50 years. But the question is how to cure them.
Now, what is the, speaking of these psychosomatic disturbances, and it is, say, tuberculosis would be one example. We are now, of course, very interested in further research in this matter in the United States, and for that matter, other parts of the world. Do you have any ideas as to why the patient selects this type of symptom?
He doesn't select them.
He doesn't
happen to him. You could ask Christus as well, when you are eaten by a crocodile, how you happen to select that crocodile? He hasn't selected you.
Yeah. Now, of course, for me, in a sense that unconsciously, why you're selected.
No, they even out.
You don't believe that there's any way of tracing in the personality of the individual a reason.
You see, that is an extraordinary exaggeration of the importance of the subject. As if we were choosing such things.
Now, in the whole matter of psychosomatic medicine, they have now, for example, very recently hinted that cancer may have psychosomatic involvement. And this doesn't surprise you, Rick.
No, but we know these things since only that 50 years ago. We already had these causes, the outward stomach tuberculosis, chronic arthritis, tear diseases, and psychogenesis under certain conditions.
And even cancer, the fact that cancer may have it.
Well, you see, I couldn't swear, but I have been able where I thought now I could wonder whether there was not a psychogenic reason for that particular ailment. It came too convenient.
Too convenient.
Yeah.
And so some of the studies that, for example, in the United States show that, for example, Jewish women practically never get cancer in the vaginal region.
Yes.
We're more often to get cancer, say, in the breast region, as one example.
Yes. Well, many things can be found out about cancer, I'm sure. You see, to us, it was always a question how to keep taking things. And But anything is possible. Any disease has a psychological accompaniment. And it all depends, perhaps life depends upon it, whether you treat such a patient psychologically in the proper way or not. That can help tremendously. Even if you cannot prove in the least that the disease itself is psychotherapy. Or you can have an infectious disease in a certain moment of a psychical element or a predicament, because you are particularly accessible to an infection. Yeah. Because angina is such a typical psychological disease. Yet it is not psychological in its physical causation. It's just an infection. But why then? Well, it was a psychological moment. And you see, when it is established and there's high fear and an abscess, you cannot cure it by psychology. Yet it is quite possible that you can avoid it by a proper psychological attitude.
So I was interested in psychosomatic medicine. Is pretty old stuff. You've been taught in it for 100 years. And so you're not at all surprised by the new development.
For instance, the toxic aspect of schizophrenia. I published it 50 years ago. Just 50 years ago. Now the one of this course. You see, you're far ahead in America with technological things, but in psychological matters and such things, you're 50 years back. Asians don't understand it. Because the fact that I don't want the general collective thing. You see, we are not yet aware of what they is. There are plenty more of those than people have an idea of. I told you that there is a stuff here who didn't even know what they always got was wrong, was what it was an alteration. You see, everyone who says that I'm a mystic, is just an idiot. He doesn't understand the first word of psychology. When you study human psychology, you can't help noticing that man's psychology doesn't only consist of the ramifications of instinct in his behavior. This is not the only determinant. There are many other. And the study of man from his biological aspect only is by far insufficient to understand human psychology. It is absolutely necessary that you study man also in his social and general environments. Because here, for instance, the fact that there are different kinds of society, different kinds of nations, different traditions. And to that purpose, it is absolutely necessary that one treats the problem of the human psyche from many standpoints, which is a most considerable task, naturally. Thus, after my association experiment, when I realized that there is obviously an unconscious, the question arose, now, what is this unconscious? Does it consist merely of remnants of conscious activities, or are there beings that are practically forever unconscious? In other words, is the unconscious a factor in itself? And I soon came to the conclusion that the unconscious must be a factor in itself, because I observed time and again that, for instance, the people's dreams or schizophrenic patients, delusions, fantasies, contain the motive which they couldn't possibly have acquired in our surroundings. this depends upon the fact that child is not born tabula rasa, but is a definite mixture of or combination of genes. And although the genes seem to contain chiefly dynamic factors of a certain behavior, they have a tremendous importance also for the arrangement of the psyche. Inasmuch as it appears naturally. Before it appears, you cannot study it, but in as much as it appears, it has certain qualities. It has a certain character, and that must depend upon the elements born in the child. So, factors determining human behavior are born with the child, and it determine its further development. Now that is one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is the individual lives in connection with others in certain definite surroundings that will influence the human combination of qualities. And that is now also a very complicated factor, because the environmental influences are not merely personal. There are an amount of objective factors. The general social conditions, laws, convictions, ways of looking at things, of dealing with things. Now, these things are not of an arbitrary character. They are historical. There are historical reasons why things are as they are. And as there are historical reasons for the qualities of the psyche that is born, there is such a thing as the history of man's evolution in the past years. And that shows that a real understanding of the psyche must consist in the elucidation of the history of the human race. The history of the mind, for instance, as of the biological data. So, when I wrote my first book concerning the psychology of the unconscious, I already had formed a certain idea of the nature of the unconscious. To me, it was then a living remnant of the original history of man, living in his surroundings. A very complicated picture. When I wrote my first book concerning the psychology of the unconscious, I already had formed a certain idea of the nature of the unconscious. To me, it was then a living remnant of the original history of man, living in his surroundings. A very complicated picture. My material then, my empirical material, was formed chiefly by lunatics, by cases of schizophrenia. And there I have observed that there are, chiefly in the beginning of a disease, inventions of fantasies into conscious life, fantasies of an entirely unexpected sort, makes bewildering to the patient, that gets quite confused by these ideas, and he gets into a sort of panic, because he never before has thought such things. They are quite strange to him, and equally strange to his physician. The alienist is equally dumbfounded by the peculiar character of those fantasies, and therefore will say that man is crazy and thinks such things. Yeah, they think that, and the patient agrees with him. and all the more he gets into a panic. So, as a Jungianist, I got it to be really the task for psychiatry to elucidate that thing that brought me to consciousness. His voices, these delusions. In those days, that is my more than 40 years ago, or over 50 years ago, I had no hope to be able to treat these cases or to be able to help them. But I had a very great scientific curiosity, and I wanted to know what these things really were, because I thought that these things had a system, developmental, chaotic, decayed material, because there was too much sense in those faculties. So what I did then was I studied cases of cytogenic diseases like hysteria, hystericism, somnambulism, and such things, where the content that's coming from the unconscious were in a readable condition, in an understandable condition. And then I saw that, in contradistinction to the schizophrenics, the mental contents of hysterics were of a usually understandable character. They were even elaborate, dramatic, suggestive, insinuating. Someone could work out a second personality. Now, that is not the case of schizophrenia. And there, the fantasies, on the contrary, are unsystematic, chaotic, and you cannot make out a proper second personality. Apart from that, cases of a complicated nature. I knew of psychopathic cases, just in the balance between schizophrenia and hysteria, where ideas came up, delusions that were not exactly hysterical, because they were singularly difficult to understand. It was sort of strange eruptions, and I thought that these cases could give me a better understanding. So I took the opportunity when Professor Furma, the old professor of psychology and philosophy at the University of Geneva, when he published a case of an American girl who had bestowed upon him a series of half-poetic and romantic fantasies. He published this material without commenting on them. He gave it as an example of creative imagination. Now, when I read those fantasies, I saw this is exactly the material. And I was always a bit afraid when I tell of my personal experiences with patients that they will say, oh, this is a really suggestion, I took that case because I surely had no hand in it. It was old Professor Fruller, an authority. He was a friend of William Chase. I knew him personally, a very fine old man. And he certainly wouldn't be accused of having influenced the patient. That is the reason why I analyzed these fantasies, and that case became the object of a whole book called The Psychology of Consciousness. It is called now Symbolism of Transformation. And I have revised it out for 40 years. It needed it. Yeah, because it was in the first attempt. And there I tried to show that there is a sort of unconscious, I then simply called it neo-conscious, that clearly produces things which are historical and not personal. It was is a logical material of the nature of which was it understood neither by the doer nor by the patient. And there I tried for the first time to produce a picture of the functioning of the unconscious, a functioning which allowed certain conclusions as to the nature of the unconscious. Then, after I had written that book, that cost me my friendship with Freud because he wouldn't accept it. To him, the unconscious was a product of consciousness, and it simply conveyed with the venom. I mean, it was a sort of storm where all the discarded things of consciousness were heaped up and left. But to me, the unconscious then was already a matrix, a sort of basis of consciousness of a creative nature, namely capable of autonomous acts, autonomous intrusions into consciousness. In other words, I took the existence of the unconscious for a real fact, or for a real autonomous factor capable of independent action. And now that was a problem, a psychological problem of the very first order. And that made me think seriously, because the role of philosophy in our days has not yet recognized this fact, that we have a counter-actor in our unconscious, that in our psychic there are two. Consciousness is one factor, and there is another factor, equally important, that is your conscious, that can interfere with consciousness on any kind of basis. And of course, I say to myself now, this is very uncomfortable, because I think that I am the only master in my house, but I must admit that there is another somebody in that house that can play trick. And I had to deal with the unfortunate victims of that interference every day in my patients. So the next thing I wrote was in 1918, and a disquisition about the relation between the ego and the unconscious, where I tried to formulate the experiences that are more or less regularly observable in cases where consciousness is exposed to unconscious data, to interferences or intrusions, where the unconscious is considered as an autonomous factor that has to be taken seriously. Where it doesn't say anymore or undervalue the unconscious by assuming it is nothing but a discarded remnant of consciousness. It is a factor in its own dignity, and a very important factor, because it can create the most horrible disturbances. Now, that was a pamphlet I wrote. I was published in French, and nobody understood it. I saw that the reason why nobody understands it is that why nobody had a similar experience, because the question hasn't been pursued to such an end. Namely, that one has taken the unconscious seriously and considered it as a real factor that can determine human behavior to a very considerable degree. I began an examination of the human attitudes, namely how our consciousness functions. I couldn't help seeing versus the difference between Freud and Albert. Typical difference. The one assumes that the thieves evolve along the line of the sex instinct. The other assumes that thieves evolve along the line of power drive. And there I was in between the two, with the justification of both view. I also see the same for other. And I knew that there are plenty of other ways in which things could be envisaged. And so I consider my scientific duty to examine first the condition of the human consciousness that is the originator of ways of envisaging. It is the fact that produces attitudes, conscious attitudes towards certain phenomena. So when you know, for instance, that there are people who see the difference between red and green, you can take it for a fact that everybody sees that difference. Not at all. There are cases of totemism and so on, you know. The one sees this, the other sees that, and I tried to find out what the principal differences were. And that is the book about the types. So first is introverted, extroverted attitude, then the functional aspects, and each of the four functions is predominant. Now, mind you, these four functions were not a scheme I had invented and applied to psychology. On the contrary, I took quite a long time to discover that there is a lot of type, but distinctly type. Because I thought my type is of course that is human. It is not. There are other people who decide the same problems I had to decide in an entirely different way. They look at things in an entirely different way. They have entirely different values. They are versus phenotypes. And so, after a while, I discovered that there are intuitive types. It gave me much trouble. It took me over a year to become somewhat clear about the existence of intuitive types. And the last, and the most unexpected, was the sensation type. And only later on I saw that those are naturally the core aspects of conscious orientation. You can increase the number of principles, but I found that the most simple way is the way I told you. As the division by 4 is a simple and natural division of a circle. I didn't know the symbolism of those particular classification. Only when I studied the archetypes, I became aware that it is a very important archetype that had a paint and an over forward. I also found in the study of the types that it is a certain link as to the personal nature of the unconscious, the personal quality of the unconscious in a given case. But if you take an extrovert, well, his unconscious has then an introverted quality, because all the extroverted qualities are played in consciousness, and the introverted let be the unconscious, therefore it has introverted quality, and so on with the functions the same. That gave me a lead of the diagnostic value. It helped me to understand my patients.
So, Professor Jung, so you began to see, in a sense, your typologies led to a sort of a theory of a psychology of opposites, that the conscious would reveal one side of a type and the unconscious would be the other side. Yeah. And that this would be a very important way then of helping you to analyze and understand the individual.
From a practical point of view, quite important. Well, the point I wanted to elucidate is, you know, in analyzing a patient, you make a typical experiment. Namely, there is a sort of typical way in which the integration of consciousness that takes place. Namely, the average way is that through the analysis of trees, for instance, you become acquainted with the contents of their cultures. I already told you this. To begin with, all personal material, subjective questions of the individual, difficulties in adapting to environmental conditions, and so on. Now, it is a regular observation that when you talk to an individual, and the individual gives you insight into its inner preoccupation, people, emotions, in other words, hands over his personal complexes, then you get slowly into the situation of a sort of authority. You become a point of reference. You know, you are in possession of all the important items in a person's development. I remember, for instance, Anna is a very well-known American politician. And he told me, any amount of the secrets of his trade. And suddenly he jumped up and said, "Thank God, what have I done? You know, you got $1 million. Say what I have to do now." I said, "Well, I'm not interested. You can sleep in peace. I cannot betray you. I will get it within a fortnight." Now, you see, that shows that the things people hand out are not merely in different forms. When it comes to something important, emotionally important, then they hand out themselves. They hand out a big emotional value, as if they were handing over a large sum, as if they were trusting you with the administration of their estate. And they're tiring your hand. Often I hear things that could mean those people. Actually, if it probably known. Or it would give me, if I should have any blackmailing tendencies, unlimited power to the blackmailing. Well, you see, that creates an emotional relationship to the enemy. And that is what Freud called the platform, which is a central problem of analytic psychology. It is just so as if these people had handed out their whole existence. That can have very peculiar effects upon the individual. Either they hate you for it or they love you for it, but you are not indifferent to them. And there is then a sort of emotional relation between the patient and the doctor. You know, when you hand out such material, these contents are associated with all the important persons in the life of a patient. Now, the most important persons are usually father and mother. That comes up from childhood. The first troubles are with our. So, in handing over your infantile memories about the father or about the mother, you hand over also the image of father and mother. And then it is just as if the doctor had taken the place of the father, even of the mother. I had quite a number of male patients that called me Mother Yo, because they handed over the mother to me. Yeah, she was very enough. But you see, that's quite irrespective of the personality of the analyst. If is simply disregarded, he functions as if he were the mother, or he functions as if he were the father, the central authority. Now, that is what one calls a physical case of projection. Now, Freud doesn't exactly call it projection, he calls it transformation. That is an allusion to the old superstitious idea of handing over the transferring a disease upon an animal, or handing over the sin upon a scapegoat, and a scapegoat takes it out into the desert to make it disappear. So they hand over themselves in the hope that I can swallow that stuff and digest it for a day. And so I am in the hope of anti and have a high authority. Naturally, I'm also persecuted by the corresponding resistances. All the manifold emotional reactions they have had against their parents. Now, that is the stuff you have to work through in analyzing the situation. Because a patient needs a interpretation, not free. It's totally dependent upon the doctor. Like a patient with an open abdomen on the operating table. In the eyes of the surgery, got better or worse. And so the thing must be finished. And so we have to work through that condition in the hope that we arrive in a situation where the patient is able to see that I am not the father or not the mother, that I am an ordinary human being. Now, everybody naturally should assume that such a thing would be possible, that a patient could arrive at such an insight when he is not a complete idiot, that I am just a doctor, and you know, that emotional figure of their fantasies. But that is very often not the case. I had a case that was an intelligent young woman. She was a student of philosophy, very good mind, where one could expect easily that she would see that I am not a parental authority. But she was actually unable to get out of this delusion. And in such a case, one always has recourse to the dreams. It is just as if one would ask the unconscious, now what do you say to such a condition? You see, she says, within the unconscious, of course, I know you are not my father, but I just feel like that. It is like that. I depend upon you. And I say, now you see what the unconscious says. Now the unconscious produce dreams in which I really assume a very curious role. So she was the little infant. She was sitting on my knees. I held her in my arms. I was a very tender father to the little girl, you know. And the last dream of that series was, I cannot tell you all the dreams, was that it was out in nature. I stood in a field of wheat, you know, field of wheat that was ripe for harvest. I was a giant, and I held her in my arm like a baby. And the wind was blowing over that field of wheat. Now, you know, when the wind is blowing over wheat field, these waves, the wind fear. And with these waves, I swayed like that, and putting her as if it were to sleep, you know. And she felt as being in the arms of the Godhead. So now the harvest is ripe. And I was telling her. And I told her, you see, what you want and what you project into me, because you are not conscious of it, is you have the idea of a deity you don't possess. Therefore, you see it in me. That clicked. Because, you know, she had a rather intense religious education. Of course, it all vanished later on. And something disappeared from her world the world became merely personal, and that religious conception of the world was non-existent at hand. And so she suddenly became aware of an entirely alien image that comes fresh from the archetype. She had not the idea of a Christian God or of a Old Testament Yahweh. It was a heathenish God. You see, a God of nature, of vegetation. He was the wheat himself. He is the spirit of the wheat, the spirit of the wind. And she was in the arms of that Newman. That is the living experience of an archetype. Now, that made a tremendous impression upon that girl, and instantly it clicked. She saw what she really was missing, that missing value that was in the form of a projection in myself and made myself indispensable to her.
Yes.
Now, that is a luminous experience, you see. And that is the thing that people are looking for. An archetypal experience that gives them an incorruptible value. You see, they depend upon other conditions. They depend upon their desires, their ambitions. Depend upon other people because they have no value in themselves. They have nothing in themselves. They are only rational, and they are not in the possession of a treasure that would make them independent. But when that girl can hold that experience, then she doesn't depend anymore. She cannot depend anymore because that value is in herself. And that is a sort of liberation. And that is, of course, makes her complete, Inasmuch as she can realize such a luminous experience, she is able to continue her path, her way, her individuation. The acorn can become an oak and not a donkey. Nature will take her course. She will become that which she is from the beginning. Now, having seen such cases, quite a number of such cases, that, of course, has given me a motive to study the archetype, because I began to see that the structure of what I then call the collective unconscious is really a sort of agglomeration of such typical images, of which each has a numinous quality, The archetypes are at the same time dynamic. They are instinctual images that are not intellectually even. They are always there, and they produce certain processes in the unconscious that one could best compare with me. But that's the origin of mythology. Mythology is a pronouncing of series of images that formulate the life of archetypes. And so the statements of every religion, of many poets and so on, are statements about the inner ecological process, which is a necessity because man is not complete if he is not conscious of that aspect of his. So a man is not complete when he is in a world of statistical truth. He must live in a world of with biological truth, that with his biological truth that we not here with statistics, of with the expression of what he really is, as what he feels himself. So he somebody without the mythology. is really an effect of statistics, as it were, the elaborate phenomenon. And while the truth is, the carriers of life are individuals, not average number, yet our natural science links everyone to an average, reduces everything to an average, and of course, all the individual qualities are wiped out. But that, of course, is most unbecoming. It is unhygienic. It deprives people of their specific values, where they are individually. It deprives them of the most important experience of their life, where they experience their own value, the creative background of their personality. I think it's obvious that nobody understands things apparently.
Do you think that the humanity are important for the individual who wants to study the individual?
When they say what? An education without humanity is a spiritual man. It was just the connection with this family, as it were, that means with the whole standing in the power, the connection with the power, that he lives in that in which man always has lived. Man has power with the myth. And we think we are able to be born today and to live in normal, without that it is as absolutely abnormal, because man is not learning every day. He was born in a specific historical setting with the specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a related to the state. And if you are born without eyes and ears, when you are growing up with no connection with the past, full natural with the sample of natural science, there is no connection with the past. We can write it out, and that is a mutilation of the human being. Now I go to my back to the idea that this kind of perceiving had a most extraordinary therapeutic effect. I can tell you that, okay, well, about a young girl, the father was a baker, and she had received the entire worldly education. She had no idea of any tradition of thought. And then I went further into her history and found out that her grandfather had been a Sadiq in Galicia. And when I knew that, I knew the whole story. That girl suffered from a phobia, a terrific phobia, had been in a psychoanalytic treatment already. There's no effect. And she was really badly plagued by that phobia. The anxiety stage was also. And then I saw that girl has lost the connection with the past, has lost, for instance, the fact that her grandfather was a Sadiq, that he lived in the myth, and her father has brought her out of it too. So I simply told her, you would that what your fear is? You know what to have it on? And we did make a podcast. I said, your fear is the fear of your way. You know the effect was that within a week she was cured from so many years of bad anxiety state. Because it went like a rifle for her. But I only could say it because I knew that he is absolutely not. She thought she was in the middle of things, but she was not sprung. Not made no sense. What is our existence, when we are just average numbers, The more you make people to average numbers, the more you destroy our society. The ideal state, then you got and go to Rotterdam. There's wonderful. There you can be a number, but what pays it very nearly. Our whole life goes to incubated. And so here I had plenty of cases of a similar kind. And that has naturally led me on to a profound study of the archetype. Because more respectful of archetype, and now that thing should be taken into account. That is an enormous factor, very important for our further development, for our well-being. It was, of course, difficult to know where to begin because it is such an enormously extended field. And the next question I asked myself was, now where in the world has anybody been busy with that problem? And nobody, except a peculiar spiritual moment that went together with the beginnings of Christianity, namely the Gnostic. And that was the first thing I'd say, remember, very well converted with the problem of archetype, and made a peculiar philosophy. And everybody makes a peculiar philosophy when they come across it naively, and then we know that those are structural elements of the cultural psyche. Now they have lived in the first, second, and third centuries, and what was in between? Nothing. And now today we can fall into that hole and are confronted by the problems of the collective unconscious, which were then the same in 2000 years ago, and we are not prepared to create that problem. I was always looking for something between, something that makes that remote path with the present moment about to why amazing with this alchemy that is understood to be the history of chemistry. In this, one could almost say nothing less to that. It is a peculiar, more spiritual movement of the philosophical movement that call no doubt philosopher, like Gnosticism. And then I read the whole accessible literature, Latin and Greek, because there was enormous interest in it. It is the maker work of 1,700 years in which they stored up all they could lay out about the nature of the archetype in a peculiar way. That's truly, it is not simple. And most of the texts are not published in Greek. No one published since the Middle Ages. There are also these in the middle or end of the 16th century, all in Latin, and some texts are in Greek. And not of being very important ones. That has given me no end of work. But the result was most satisfactory because it showed me the development of our unconscious relations to the collective of culture. And to variations, our consciousness had undergone. While being unconscious term, which created mythological images. For instance, such phenomena as in Libido of soul, that are psychical phenomena, and we've got to understand these things. If it is just as so as it a terrific epidemic of typhoid fever, the breaking out, and they say now this is typhoid fever. Using that now the feelings we can take on in all its dimensions. And nobody knows anything about it. Nobody takes care of the water supply. Nobody thinks of its handling, the meat or something like that. Well, simply states that this is a phenomenon, yes, but what doesn't understand it. And to me, of course, it was an enormous problem because it was a factor that has determined the fate of millions of European people and of America. Nobody can deny that he has been influenced by the war. But that is all it could do. And that's all psychology, all truly psychology. But you only come to an understanding of these things when you understand the background from which it springs. And so, of course, I cannot tell you in detail about about autonomy. It is in the basis of our modern way of doing things. And therefore, it is as if it were right, but it is the threshold of culture. It's a wonderful picture of how the development of archetypes, the world of archetypes looks, when you look upon them as if from a wall, maybe from today, you look back at with the past and you see how the present moment has evolved out of the past. It is just as if the alchemistic philosophy sounds little curious. We should be the mentality from me, attitude from me, called hermetic philosophy. Of course, that conveys just a bit at the term alchemy. It is the parallel development as Gnosticism was to the conscious development, say, of Christianity, of our Christian philosophy, of the whole psychology of the Middle Ages. And so you see, in our days, they have second view of the world, that's a philosophy. But in the occultism, we have a different one. And that's we can see through the example of the alchemistic philosophy that moves towards the medieval consciousness exactly like the unconscious behaves to ourselves. And we can construct or even predict the unconscious of our day when we know what it has been yesterday. Now that will, in a few words, the development of my idea without going into detail. According to
for you, Brian, not the radio, they are Alfredo, unless you're writing, of course.
Well, people have been to read the book by Eric. That is right off the fact that I'm sorry.